Hello, and thank you for joining this session of the second MIT Applied Energy Symposium. So today I'll talk about gas to power technologies for supporting grid-scale renewables integration and discuss its role in this transition towards a greenhouse gas emissions-free energy economy. So today I'd like to build my discussion around one possible pathway to large-scale storage. And here I'm talking about power to gas energy conversion, or more broadly, power to chemicals conversion, where the storage media could be hydrogen or syngas or some other high value chemical or complex hydrocarbon. And my objective is to share with you some thoughts about the opportunities and challenges associated with using this technology to provide grid scale energy storage, and then to what extent it can support a transition to a renewable grid of the future. So here is how I've planned to structure my presentation today. I'm going to start by providing some context for why this topic is relevant, and then present a brief high-level overview of power-to-gas state-of-the-art. Then I'll share my thoughts about the extent to which this technology can provide flexible grid-level storage, what the key system-level issues are, and what the possible directions we can take from here. So, as many of you are pretty much aware of, one of the most important contributors to CO2 emissions is the burning of fossil fuels for energy. Consequently, developing and deploying grid-level renewable energy sources could potentially be one of the most impactful technology evolutions of the century. So, looking at the slide I'm showing here, you can see projections of the energy grid generation mix by 2050 for the US under different renewable energy penetration scenarios. And on the right, you see corresponding potential for greenhouse gas mitigation. In this case, we are looking at CO2 specifically. So take, for instance, in the situation where you have 80% renewable energy penetration, we get almost an equivalent amount of reduction in CO2 emissions, which is, I think, also about 80%, a little more than that, compared to the baseline. So this is a big positive. But if you take a closer look at the chart, you're going to see that to achieve this 80% reduction, we would need a generation mix with over 60% reliance on wind and solar sources. And I think that this reliance is relevant to the next point that I'll be making. So, while a high degree of renewables integration can give us significant credits in carbon emissions, they also introduce challenges that derive from their intrinsic characteristics. Firstly and primarily, power production from renewable sources, let's take wind for instance, same goes for solar, is that it's highly intermittent. So the power supply fluctuates dramatically and sometimes unpredictably. The second problem, which is very much related to the first, is that very often renewable power supply does not match the demand profile because peak generation hours do not align with peak demand hours, producing this temporal mismatch. So the kind of value proposition here is that deploying large-scale energy storage technologies with on-demand dispatch can smooth out these peaks and valleys in renewable energy availability and resolve the problem of temporal mismatch. I mean, the consequence of this is that it can improve the overall resiliency of the grid and potentially go a long way in supporting the transition to a global renewable energy economy. So, the question I would like to address today is whether the power-to-gas technology can adequately back up this value proposition. So there are a number of storage technologies that can support renewables integration, ranging from mechanical systems like flywheels to supercapacitors all the way to large-scale thermochemical energy storage. And if you look at the chart, you notice that their storage potential often involves a trade-off between energy density and power density. Now, from the perspective of the grid, energy storage is not just a single item. Instead, it's a portfolio of services across a range of timescales that address different flexibility and resiliency issues relevant to renewables integration. So for instance, the first that comes to mind is capacity. In the event that a renewable power source fails, for example, maybe there is no wind or there is no solar. But then, as you can see, different technologies might be required depending on the time frame or the time scale of the when for which this capacity is required. And then, so from this lens, you could see that technologies like power to gas will be well suited to services that provide, let's say, long-term capacity or medium-term load following. So hopefully, technological advances in this space would improve their performance for this kind of natural fit set of services, but also extend their ability to cover a wider range of services. So I think the central takeaway from this is that as we make progress in resolving the technological challenges specific to certain storage technologies, it's important to place it in the context of the larger integrated energy economy and then address those particular aspects that enable it to support large-scale renewable deployment. And then this will involve understanding, identifying, and minimizing associated penalties, both with the core technology and also with the enabling technologies, without necessarily requiring radical or expansive changes to existing energy infrastructure. Okay, so now I've built up the context of the background for the case I'm making today. Let's take a closer look at power to gas technologies. Now, the primary value proposition for power to gas technologies, makes sense in the context of its potential role in the larger integrated energy economy. So let's just run through this cartoon that you've seen here on the screen. So let's say we have like a wind farm or solar farm or some source of intermittent renewable energy, which supplies electricity to the grid to meet some specified electricity demand. So when there is more generation than is needed, so for example, if there's an excess of supply, the excess electricity can be redirected to a power to gas conversion reactor, where it provides the energy to transform maybe some primary feedstock into a higher value energy vector or carbon vector, depending on the feedstock composition. So you end up producing maybe chemicals like hydrogen or syngas, which can be stored for later use. The whole idea is that this stored chemical or product gas, can be reused to produce supplemental electricity when there is a supply deficit from the renewable source. Or alternatively, as indicated by the bottom box towards the right, it can serve as a precursor feedstock to a wide range of chemical manufacturing processes. So now that we've gotten a sense of the place of power to gas technologies in an integrated energy system, let's take a closer look at this family of technologies. At least let's give me a chance to explain why I'm even talking about them in the first place. So in general, and this is pretty much very, very high level, power to gas comprises those group of technologies where electrical energy drives chemical conversions that effectively stores electrical energy in chemical bonds. So the advantage is that they provide a pathway for producing energy carriers and possibly chemical precursors for chemical manufacturing. And then in some specific applications where the process involves greenhouse gas feedstock like CO2, they can also create value-added chemicals that effectively serve as carbon sinks mitigating overall CO2 emissions. Now, the process underlying this conversion, ranges from, plasma catalysis to all the way to electrolysis. So I will use plasma catalysis as a vehicle for the discussion today, but I believe that the conclusions and implications more or less generalize to the entire set of power-to-gas technologies. Okay, so kind of a closer look at plasma catalysis. I think the issue is that in general, the conversion reactions involved in power-to-gas energy conversion systems are thermodynamically unfavorable at ordinary conditions, but can proceed in a plasma environment. Essentially, plasma comprises kind of a rich mixture of ionized gases and energized electrons that are created from the interaction of gases with an imposed electromagnetic field. So what they really do is that they create these kind of local non-equilibrium states that facilitate these reactions. And then in many cases, plasma is used in conjunction with some other material catalysts to improve product selectivity. So why are we interested in plasma catalysis for this application? I think the main reason derives from the fact that the electricity input to this plasma reactor can be switched on and off depending on the availability of electricity. And this feature makes it amenable for integration with the fluctuating power supply, which is typical in renewable energy sources. But there is a caveat which relates to the state of the art of the technology. So on the right, I show a comparative chart of energy efficiency as a function of conversion for a variety of CO2 splitting processes. This is based on data collected from different literature sources. Just in terms of just explain a little bit what you have here. So this acronym, so MW represents microwave, so it's a type of plasma generation technology. GA is gliding arc, and then DBD refers to dielectric bed deck. But then the primary takeaway from this chart is that, based on the current state of the art, no one has got it all. So for instance, of these primary technology classes, so some like microwave, you could see that it really has pretty high energy efficiency, and some other extremes could also demonstrate pretty high conversion. But then it never has the two at the same time. And also secondly, these systems need to operate very close to vacuum to be able to get those kind of performance levels. The most common one is the DBD, but it's plagued with pretty low energy efficiency. Then in between them, you have the gliding arc technology, which has relatively high energy efficiency, but then very low conversion efficiencies. So I guess the question now is that if this is our reality, if this is the current state of the art, how well can this technology provide flexible storage to support renewables integration? Let's think about this question. Let's rephrase this question. So we want to know if this technology can adequately provide flexible storage to support the integration of renewables, and so support the transition to a low CO2 emissions economy. So we will be asking the following questions. Is it truly flexible? So is it a truly flexible storage option? Is there some penalty associated with this option? Or rather, what is the nature and the magnitude of the penalty? And subsequently, taking both of these into account, what are the key technology hurdles that need to be overcome to enhance its potential? So to answer these questions, we can set up the experiment shown here. So you can think of this as starting from the renewable energy source, which could be like a wind farm, and then some feedstock, for instance, biogas or some mixture of methane and carbon dioxide. So these serve as inputs to the plasma reactor. So when there is an excess of renewable energy, so more supply than demand, you redirect that excess electricity to the plasma reactor to drive this reaction to produce syngas. And then you store the syngas in this, some adequate or ideal storage system. Now, if you now get to the situation of the time when there is a deficit in the production of renewable electricity, then you now redispatch the stored syngas by maybe burning it in a passing it through a gas turbine to produce electricity, which you now use send back to the grid to make up for the deficit. So this is the setup for the experiment, and then this is what we're going to use to answer the question I had just listed. And then just to provide a little bit more of the details, so we are picking a particular technology based on its current reported performance, and it's based on the gliding arc plasma generation technology, which, like I mentioned, has relatively low conversion efficiency, but on the other hand, relatively high energy efficiency. Okay, so let's address the first question. Now, can this technology provide flexible storage? So you see from the power supply chart I have here that the hybrid plant is able to demonstrate sufficient dynamic response to renewable power supply fluctuation. So what I'm showing here is just considering, think about a 24-hour period, but then we model this for a much longer time frame. However, as you can see from the offset box, within the model time period, it did not have sufficient capacity from the stored energy to provide for the deficit period. So we kind of had to borrow supplemental syngas to meet the required energy supply. We're going to see later that this has a lot to do with the efficiency of the overall recycle loop. But nevertheless, I think this is an important consideration for assessing the viability of the storage option. Now, the second question, which I think is probably the most important question, is at what cost does it provide this flexible storage? So let's start with the normalized input energy source, so it's 100%. So passing through the reactor, we have a reactor conversion efficiency of about 85%, so we have a 15% penalty. Now moving on, it gets to storage, there may be some compression there that may also cost you another 10%. But in any case, the bulk of the exergy loss or the bulk of the efficiency penalty occurs with a redispatch, in this case using a gas turbine plant to produce electricity to make up for the deficit, which ends up giving us a round-trip efficiency of just about 45 to 46% in a combined cycle plant. Now, let's put this in context. I've placed to the right the efficiency values for battery system and also for pumped hydro storage. So for this current system, with an 85% storage efficiency, the gliding arc plasma reactor has an energy efficiency just snugly in between that of a lithium-ion battery, which is about 85 to 98%, and pumped hydro, which is about 70 to 85. So if you stop there, we're doing pretty well. However, the round-trip efficiency is where the problem is, because that actually drops all the way to 46%, which means that you are ending up with an equivalent of about 40% penalty if you include just the redispatch portion. And this gets us to a level that is significantly lower than that for battery or pumped hydro storage. So I think at this stage, it becomes very clear that the largest impact with respect to minimizing the overall energy penalty will come from using a much more efficient power generation technology. Possible options include like solid oxide fuel cells, molten carbonate fuel cell technologies. The only drawback is that those are still under development, so they're not off the shelf, and there's still some way to go to make them standard and commercial. But I think you begin to get the picture of the challenges that this faces. And I think most importantly that you have to look beyond the core technology to the other surrounding enabling technologies. So from what I've shown so far, I think it becomes evident that there is a lot of room for improving the technologies underlying this integrated storage system. So let's start with the reactor. So some of the research needs, you know, include resolving the trade-off between energy conversion, energy efficiency, and conversion efficiency. And this requires rethinking, things like the catalyst design, understanding how to better control the plasma catalyst interactions, reimagining reactor configurations that leverage synergies, but plasma and catalytic synergies, and then ultimately addressing the problem of product selectivity. Now, addressing the issue of product selectivity, directly connects to the storage related challenges. So in the example I just talked about, we have the product as syngas, but then it does contain a significant amount of CO2, and that is responsible for a lot of the energy penalty from compression, and also a lot of the space dedicated to storing this gas. So ultimately, you want to improve the energy density of your storage medium. One other approach, to address this is to look at unconventional storage strategies. For example, people are looking at the use of metal organic frameworks to provide storage for gases. Now for power, and this has to do with the redispatch and the most important part as far as energy penalties are concerned, it's important to reduce the round-trip efficiency penalty by using high efficiency power generation technologies. I mentioned earlier something like solid oxide fuel cells can work, but looking in that direction will be very, very important for making this a viable option. But then, like with everything, there are secondary effects to consider. So, for example, imagining, like I mentioned, the reactor exhaust stream has a lot of CO2. You're gonna have to wonder whether it's worth it, to use, dedicated, develop this whole metal organic framework system to store a whole bunch of carbon dioxide. So that's an important question. So you may have to introduce separation and consider all the secondary consequences of that. Secondly, what if you increase the energy density of the product? Through a single step process, you end up with hydrogen or with some higher value olefin. You have to think about whether sending it back and burning it for energy is the most economic or even the most environmentally sensible decision to make. So these are like important things to consider. And while they are not necessarily easy issues to address, I think they're important issues to at least be aware of. Okay, so now some final thoughts to leave you with, just to summarize the discussion we've been having so far. So the good news is that power to gas technologies, offers a legitimate pathway to grid-scale energy storage. And this is very much thanks to their ability to absorb excess renewable energy generation to make up when and then also to redispatch it to make up when there's a deficit in anticipated capacity. The caveat is that the round-trip efficiency associated with these technologies are limited by a series of conversion penalties from the reactor all the way to the redispatch. And the most significant is the redispatch, so that's the power generation technology. So to that end, advances in both the core technology, that's the reactor technology, as well as the enabling technologies like the power dispatch technology will go a long way in improving the overall performance. And finally, in order to get a more complete picture of the feasibility, and here I'm thinking about the economic feasibility of these technologies, and in fact, I think this applies to any storage technology whatsoever, as long as it has some ambition to provide large-scale grid-level storage. We need to match, the dynamic characteristics of each technology with a portfolio of possible services that you can provide. In other words, we have to set this up and solve it like an optimization problem. So on the side of energy, we should think, what grid services can it provide? Maybe capacity, only capacity, or energy for real-time or day-ahead markets, or also a whole bunch of ancillary services. Then on the side of the products, we have to look at, particularly if we have like a higher value product like hydrogen, what is the market value of this particular product stream? Then we take all these together and combine it into a composite revenue stream, which we optimize given the physical characteristics of the system. And of course, if this is a new build, we may want to think about, other things like, co-location benefits, either with the grid or with the industrial facility. Anyway, I hope this has raised some points and some ideas for you to think about. And I hope I'm actually looking forward to a lively conversation related to these topics I've presented. So I'd like to end my talk here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present this, and also like to thank you for your attention. And then before I close this out, I'd also like to acknowledge Maggie Smith, who's responsible for some of the analysis you saw in the earlier slides. So thank you very much, Maggie. And I wouldn't close this without giving a very quick promo for CISO, the group I work with at Argonne. So it's a Center for Energy, Economic, and Environment Systems at Argonne. And then we do a lot of work focused on integrated energy systems, looking at everything from power grid reliability all the way to modeling unit commitment of different energy and energy storage technologies. I guess if you have any interest in technology or interaction between technologies and the energy grid and energy market interactions and want to have a conversation about it, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. So with that, thank you very much for listening. I look forward to a very lively discussion around this topic. And I also hope that you find the other presentations in this session valuable and very informative. Thank you very much.